The summer of 1346 had been long and cruel. England's king, Edward III, had crossed the Channel with an army of veterans, hardened men, who had tasted victory and blood in equal measure. His invasion of France was meant to claim a throne, but what awaited him was more than politics. It was the birth of a new kind of warfare. Edward's men were exhausted. They had raided their way across Normandy, harried by pursuit, burdened by loot, their supply lines stretched thin. Now, outside the small village of Crécy and Ponthieu, they turned at bay, and there, the king chose his ground. It was a decision that would echo through centuries of war. The field sloped gently downward, toward the French approach, open, dry, with ditches and hedges forming natural defenses. Edward placed his men with care, archers on the flanks, men-at-arms in the center, and a reserve of cavalry and archers on a second ridge. Stakes were driven into the ground before the archers sharpened wooden poles, angled outward to break the charge of any horseman foolish enough to press forward. To most observers, it looked suicidal. The English army numbered perhaps 12,000, the French, more than twice that, and among the French ranks stood the flower of European chivalry, hundreds of knights clad in full plate, nobles from every corner of France, Italy, and the Empire, each adorned with colors, crests, and gold. They were the living image of medieval might. But Edward had no illusions about their honor or their arrogance. He knew the French knights would come on, proud and overconfident, seeking glory, and he knew what his longbowmen could do. The longbow was not a weapon of nobility, it was the tool of the commoner, the yeoman. Each bow was taller than its owner, cut from English, its draw weight so great that it warped the bones of archers' arms over years of training. A single arrow could travel more than 200 yards and, at closer range, could drive through mail and even thin plate. These men had trained from childhood. Every Sunday, by royal decree, Englishmen practiced the bow. They grew into living weapons, men whose arms could pull 120 pounds of tension, whose eyes could judge distance like falcons. They were not noble, not knightly, but they were deadly. By the afternoon of the 26th of August 1346, the battle lines were drawn. The air was heavy and hot. Dust hung over the valley, stirred by thousands of hooves. The French army, commanded by King Philip VI, approached in confusion. They had marched too far, too fast, chasing the English without rest or order. Yet pride drove them onward. At their head rode mercenary, Genoese crossbowmen, paid soldiers armed with short, powerful crossbows. Behind them, row upon row of mounted knights waited impatiently, their banners snapping, their squires shouting, their tempers boiling under the weight of armor and heat. Edward, calm and deliberate, surveyed the field from his windmill on the hill. When he saw the French forming, he gave a simple order: let them come. The first clash was chaos. The Genoese crossbowmen advanced, cranking their weapons laboriously, then loosed a volley. The range was too great. Their bolts fell short. Worse, the rain earlier that day had soaked their bowstrings, dulling their power. The longbowmen answered a rippling wave of English arrows arcing skyward. They fell with a sound like tearing cloth, a whisper that turned into a scream. The crossbowmen faltered, their formation broken under the sudden, relentless storm. Within minutes, hundreds fell. Horses screamed. Men dropped their weapons. Shields split beneath the hail. Behind them, the French knights saw the mercenaries stumble and in fury mistook it for cowardice. Philip's commanders shouted for the charge. Trumpets blared, then thunder. Thousands of hooves churned the ground as armored cavalry surged forward. Lances lowered, banners flew, the full weight of French chivalry bearing down on the English line. It was a sight to stir any heart. But Edward's men did not move. They waited. When the knights hit the slope, the archers fired again. Volley after volley, relentless as the tide. Horses shrieked, collapsing mid-stride. Riders toppled, crushed beneath armor that was now a coffin. Gaps opened in the French charge. More pressed forward, only to find the ground slick with blood and mud. Some knights reached the English line, striking at the stakes with swords and axes, but they were isolated, surrounded. English men-at-arms, fighting on foot, stabbed through visors, dragged nobles from their saddles, and finished them in the mire. The second wave came, then the third. Each was met by the same deadly rhythm. Draw, loose, draw, loose, draw. By evening, the field below Crécy was a nightmare. Thousands of bodies lay twisted, horses piled upon one another. Among the fallen were the proudest names of France, counts, dukes, barons, all broken beneath the storm of arrows. The King of Bohemia, old and blind, had charged with his squires guiding his horse by reins tied together. They found him later, his armor riddled with shafts, his crest trampled into the mud. King Philip himself was nearly killed, his horse slain beneath him. He fled with the remnants of his army as darkness fell. When the fighting ended, the English lit torches and surveyed the field. What they saw was no ordinary victory, it was the end of an era. Never before had the flower of knighthood been destroyed, not by equal opponents, but by commoners with bows. The longbow had turned warfare from the duel of the elite into the slaughter of the many. Chroniclers would later write of Crécy with awe and horror. They spoke of the rain of arrows, of the iron storm, of how proud men drowned in mud beneath the weight of their own armor. For centuries, the mounted knight had been the symbol of dominance, the warrior ideal. But at Crécy, under a hot French sun, they had been made obsolete. As dawn rose the next morning, the English moved among the corpses, stripping weapons and armor from the dead. They found men still breathing beneath horses, begging for mercy. Some were ransomed, most were not. The stench of blood and sweat hung thick. King Edward, observing the carnage, gave thanks to God, but his captains knew what had truly won the day, not divine favor, but discipline, training, and the relentless will of England's archers. That afternoon, the medieval world changed. Armor could no longer guarantee safety. Nobility could no longer guarantee victory. Power had shifted from the high saddle to the muddy ranks of men who could loose death from afar. Crécy was not just a battle, it was a reckoning. Autumn 1415. The 100 Years' War had dragged on for generations. A tangle of claims and vengeance between two royal houses. England's young king, Henry V, had crossed the Channel to reclaim his ancestral lands in France. His campaign began with fire. Towns burned, fields razed, fortresses besieged. But disease and hunger fought harder than any Frenchman. Dysentery stalked the camp, soldiers dropped in ditches, and by the time Henry turned toward Calais, his army had shrunk to barely 6,000 men, a skeleton force limping through hostile territory. The French gathered to cut him off. They blocked the road north near the village of Agincourt, confident they would crush the invader at last. Their banners shimmered in the wet morning lilies, crosses, dragons, symbols of pride soon to be drowned in mud. Henry looked upon the sodden field and smiled grimly. He had chosen his ground once again. To his front lay a narrow plain hemmed by dense woods on both sides. It was a killing funnel. The night before, he ordered his men to drive sharpened stakes into the ground. Rows upon rows angled outward before the archers. Behind them stood the weary men at arms, pale and hollow-eyed from days without rest. At dawn, the French nobles dressed for battle as if for a coronation. They polished armor, adjusted plumes, and laughed at the thought of peasant bowmen standing in their way. Their numbers swelled beyond 20,000, the greatest host France had fielded in a century. They expected to sweep the English aside before noon, but the ground betrayed them. The previous night's rain had soaked the freshly plowed soil. Horses sank to their knees, wagons stuck fast, and the very earth seemed to conspire against the weight of steel. Still, arrogance drove them forward. Henry knelt in the mud, kissed the cross upon his sword, and rose. Today, he told his captains, we fight for God, for England, and for St. George. Then he raised his hand, the signal. A sharp cry rose from the flanks. 6,000 longbows bent as one. The first volley hissed skyward. Arrows whirled through mist and drizzle, vanishing into gray cloud, then fell. The noise was like rain upon tin, like hail against shields. Men screamed, horses shrieked, armor rang with hollow thunder. The French advance staggered. Crossbowmen tried to reply, but their shorter range meant death before they could reload. Knights urged their mounts onward, shouting for honor, for France. The narrow field crushed them together, shoulder to shoulder, knee to knee. Those behind pushed those before. Lances snapped, men toppled into sucking mud. The English archers kept loosing. They had no armor but faith and fatigue, no glory but survival. Each arrow they fired found joints, visors, armpits, the weak places in shining plate. Horses went down screaming, crushing riders beneath. Panic rippled through the French line as the rain of death never ceased. At last, sheer momentum carried the front ranks into contact with the English. The impact should have shattered the smaller force, but the mire had broken all speed. The knights arrived exhausted, their armor caked in mud that weighed them like lead. They swung swords that barely moved, gasping for breath behind visors fogged with sweat. English men-at-arms waded forward with mallets, axes, and knives, hacking at joints, stabbing fallen nobles in the visor slit, dragging them down into the muck. Behind the front, the French rear kept pressing forward, unaware that there was no room to fight. Bodies piled 3 deep. Those who slipped could not rise again. Suffocated under armor, they died without a wound. Chroniclers wrote that men drowned in the blood and rainwater pooled around their knees. Among the chaos, Henry V himself fought in the thickest press, his crown welded to his helmet so none could mistake him. A blow struck his head, denting the steel and knocking him to his knees. But his bodyguard closed ranks, and the king rose again, roaring, "Strike for England." By mid-morning the field was a single mass of mangled flesh and steel. The French nobles, once resplendent, were unrecognizable, faceless heaps in the mire. Banners lay trampled, their colors smeared with filth. The air was choked with the reek of sweat, excrement, and blood. Still, more French advanced, reckless, blinded by pride. Henry ordered his archers to drop bows and take up axes to finish the trapped men before them. They moved methodically, stabbing through gaps in plate, clubbing helmets until they split. It was not battle anymore. It was execution. In the rear, a new panic arose, rumors that fresh French cavalry were attacking the English baggage train. Fearing encirclement, Henry gave a terrible order: kill the prisoners. Hundreds of captured knights were slain on the spot. their ransoms forfeited. Even his own captains recoiled, but the king was unmoved. Mercy had no place in that swamp. When the slaughter ended, perhaps 10,000 French lay dead or dying. The English had lost a few hundred. Among the fallen were the flower of French nobility, the constable, the admiral, the dukes of Alençon, Brabant, Bar, and countless lords whose names had once filled halls with pride. Their coats of arms floated face down in the mud like forgotten relics. As night fell, the exhausted archers collapsed beside the corpses they had made. Some sang psalms, others stared silently into the darkness, hands raw from drawing bowstrings until the skin peeled. Henry walked among them, silent, his armor dented, his cloak black with grime. He had not just won a battle. He had reshaped the logic of war. At Agincourt, the English longbow reached its apex. The weapon that had humbled knights at Crécy now annihilated them. No longer could courage or lineage shield a man from the reach of common skill. A peasant with a bow could end a dynasty with one arrow. In the months that followed, bards would sing of Agincourt as divine justice. But the soldiers who were there remembered only the mud, the screaming horses, and the endless rain. They knew that day had killed more than men. It had killed an idea. That honor alone could win wars, that the fields of northern France would never forget. Long after the bodies were buried, farmers still plowed up rusted helmets, twisted arrowheads, and bones blackened by water. Each relic whispered the same truth, that on St. Crispin's Day, 1415, the proud age of knighthood drowned beneath the weight of its own arrogance. When the arrows fell silent and the blood sank into the soil, something far greater than an army had died. The age of the knight, once the very heart of Europe's pride and power, was gone, not with fanfare, but with a whisper. Drowned beneath the rain at Agincourt. In the months after Agincourt, France was a kingdom in mourning. The nobility, generations of warriors whose ancestors had charged at Courtrai, Poitiers and Tours, lay rotting beneath foreign soil. The flower of the realm had been cut down by peasants who earned less than a knight's saddle. Whole bloodlines ended in a single day. Henry V's victory was absolute. He marched through France almost unopposed, his men exhausted but unstoppable. Yet even he must have known that what had happened was not merely a triumph for England, it was the turning of an age. For centuries, Europe's power rested upon the armored knight. To be a knight was to be chosen by God and lineage, a symbol of divine strength and moral authority. They were the elite, heavy cavalry that crushed rebellion, enforced law, and upheld the social order with sword and lance. In every medieval song and tapestry, the knight stood as the pinnacle of human valor. But Crécy and Agincourt shattered that myth. It was not kings or noble blood that had turned the tide. It was the bowmen, common men who bent wood and muscle to their will. They were farmers, butchers, shepherds, soldiers made deadly by discipline. They had no armor worth naming, no horses, no gold. Yet they had precision, endurance, and patience, virtues long dismissed by the arrogant. At Crécy, they had broken the charge. At Agincourt, they had buried it. The truth spread quickly across Europe. Whispered in courts and taverns alike, armor could no longer protect its master. 1,000 years of knightly tradition crumbled in the mud. Monarchs began to question whether maintaining armies of nobles was worth their cost. The future now belonged to the foot soldier, to those who could kill from a distance. Across the Channel, England celebrated. The longbow was hailed as a miracle of English skill, a weapon that proved the strength of the common man. But for every bow that brought victory, there was a cost. The archers who returned from France were scarred, their hands twisted, their shoulders torn from decades of drawing heavy bows. They had carried England's destiny, but they also carried its trauma. In the years that followed, kings tried to replicate England's success. France, humiliated and broken, began training its own archers. Yet by then, the world was already changing. The bow, that elegant symbol of medieval revolution, soon met its successor, the gunpowder weapon. By the late 1400s, primitive handguns and cannons began to dominate the field. Arrows were replaced by lead shot, the thunder of longbows gave way to the roar of guns. The peasant archer, once the scourge of the knight, was now the ancestor of the musketeer. And so, in a strange twist of fate, the same logic that destroyed the nobility also consumed the bowman himself. But the legacy of those battles endured. The knight did not vanish overnight. For generations, nobles clung to their titles and armor, marching into wars that no longer needed them. At Pavia 1525, the last great armies of armored knights faced the new age rows of musketeers and cannons. When the smoke cleared, thousands of lords and princes lay dead once again, gunned down like cattle. The transformation was complete. What Crécy began, Agincourt affirmed, and Pavia finished. The world had entered the age of discipline over valor, technology over blood, and strategy over pride. Warfare was no longer about the clash of heroes, but about logistics, firepower, and endurance. The knight, once the master of the battlefield, was now a relic. His shining armor, a museum piece of an extinct faith in personal glory. Yet something human was lost in that transition. In the mud of Agincourt lay not just bodies but ideals. The belief that courage alone could defy death, that honor was a weapon stronger than steel, these dreams died alongside their wearers. The world became more practical, more brutal, more efficient. Even so, the memory of those doomed knights still haunts the imagination. Painters and poets would later romanticize them, noble figures silhouetted against burning skies, riding into hopeless battles with banners flying. But the truth is darker. They died not because they lacked bravery, but because bravery itself had become useless. When a rain of arrows can cut down the mightiest lord, when mud can bury an empire, what place remains for honor? The longbowmen had shown that war belonged to the many, not the few. And from that realization, all modern armies would rise. As centuries passed, the field of Agincourt became farmland again. Beneath the roots, bones still sleep, knights and archers together, their struggle now equalized by death. Archaeologists who unearthed them centuries later found arrowheads buried deep within ribs and skulls. Frozen moments of that awful day. The iron was rusted, but its message remained clear. Skill, not birth, decides survival. The echo of those arrows still lingers. Every rifle crack, every shell burst, every drone's hum carries the ghost of that first realization that distance, discipline, and precision changed humanity forever. In a way, the English archers killed more than men. They killed the idea of invincibility, and that's why historians still call Crécy and Agincourt not just victories, but revolutions. The moment the Middle Ages ended and modern war began. The story of Agincourt is a reminder that no power lasts forever. Not armor, not glory, not even kingdoms. If you want more forgotten battles, lost empires, and the grim truths buried beneath our history, subscribe and step with us into the shadows of the past.